We're used to it. You got it. We're so used to here. And I'm going to pause from time to time to see if you have questions here in the live audience, or those of you who are at home. I need to look over here. You guys are here. If you're at home, the best thing is to put something in the chat box, and then Madalena will relay it to me because I've got the PowerPoint presentation on my screen. Okay? All right then. And a word of warning, as it was in the byline of this, or under the title, there'll be some things here that might feel embarrassing, perhaps, that you say, that's not the Israel that I know and love, or the Israel that I want to know and love, perhaps. But all of this is said, from my point of view, out of love, conviction, and loyalty to the state of Israel. And it goes without saying for me that there needs to be a state of Israel, there needs to be a Jewish homeland, that never again shall we be without that situation. I also say that I don't believe that every Jew needs to live in Israel or should live in Israel. There was a time when I was much younger that I thought that. When I was a teenager in high school, I felt that every Jew needed to live in Israel. And I felt something about, and if you wanted to be a really good Jew, the best Jew you could be, you would not only live in the land of Israel, you would work the land. And that'll be a topic we'll get back to in one of our future meetings about the settler movement, because that's in my history as well. But because the Knesset is in the news so much, just the other day, many of you know, was a groundbreaking vote happened. A budget was approved, first time in 3.5 years. The Israeli government was running on an older budget. What happens in Israel, if you can't approve the budget, so two things happen, I'm sure more than two things, but one, the government has to disband, right? They need to go to elections if you can't pass the budget. And that's why there were 3 elections in such a short amount of time. And the parties, certainly Bibi Netanyahu, we'll talk about it a little bit, he let that happen, right? Because he was about to have to give up his chair as prime minister to Gantz. That was the rotation agreement. And we'll talk about rotation agreement as well, because we have one now. The other thing that happens is that you continue to use last year's budget. In other words, it's just, they Xerox it, and they just changed the year at the top, which is terribly problematic for government agencies because reality changes, right? So I'm not an expert in the Israeli budget, and I'm not even sure I'm a great expert at the Israeli Knesset, but I know more than most people in Idlewild know about this. So, and again, I'm not right. I'm making a presentation. Please feel free to ask questions, to disagree, and to look up and fact check what I've said here today. Okay, so let's take a look at the. Before we get going, we need to know Israel doesn't have a constitution. We do have some basic laws. I think there's a few countries around the world that don't have constitutions. Again, we think in American terms, constitution, we think of 3 parts of government. You kind of have to think differently, right? For instance, the president of Israel is an honorary position more than anything else. Has influence from a social point of view, has a lot of social capital.
Is he voted?
He's voted by the members of the Knesset. Yeah. So, so we don't have a president in that way. And there is only one house of the government, of the parliament. It's a parliament. And let's take a look at what the basic law from 1958. Remember, Israel was founded in 1948. It took a few years to get organized, right? And so the first part of that law is the Knesset means literally to bring together. You may know the Hebrew word for synagogue is Beit Knesset, the house of bringing together, as is the word synagogue in sun, sin, sum, symphonia, all those words in Greek, S-Y-M, S-Y-N are together, and agog means to gather, gogos. So it's a place of gathering, and there was a historical body that we don't know a lot about from historical sources, but we know a lot from rabbinic sources that maybe project backwards. The time between the prophets and the rabbis of the Talmud was the people of Israel were governed, at least in the story, the legend we tell, by Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the great assembly. So in that case, the name was appropriate. It was a recycling of an ancient name. the capital of Israel, as many of us know, mostly because of the Trump years and that controversial change that was made. The Knesset is in Jerusalem. And you know what, I now it's only dawning on me, I don't have a picture of the building. The building is a beautiful building. It's a gorgeous piece of architecture. It's in Jerusalem, and it's you can't just walk in. It's not so easy to get in, as I guess the capital is today as well. So how is the Knesset made up of? It's elected of 120 representatives, members of Knesset, or in Hebrew, Chavrei Knesset. So there's no other governing body. How is the Knesset elected? A general national election. It's direct, it's equal, secret, proportional elections in accordance with the Knesset Elections Law Committee. And this is in the law itself, the basic law. This section shall not be varied save by a majority of the members of Knesset. Being a basic law, I think it may even need a supermajority. Now, what does it mean? It means that, well, you know what? Let's go through the law, and then we'll get a little bit more animated about this. Who gets to vote? Every Israeli citizen over the age of 18 has the right to vote, and that includes also non-Jews, of course. That does not include Palestinians in the occupied territories. That's one of the stress issues of the fact that the territories are occupied and they have no representation. So, and so every Israeli has the right to vote. Good evening, folks. Welcome. Hello. Shalom uvracha. We're just going through now in a very dry, it'll get more exciting in a few minutes, but right now, the basic law of the Knesset from 1958. A party has to exist, right, in order to submit a list of candidates. So I don't know if it's like anything here. City councils, European countries work this way. You'll have a list of 120. Each party has a list of 120 with the fictitious assumption, well, what if we win all, right? If we win the entire landslide, 100%, whatever it is, or then we'll have 120 members. So proportionally, and we'll get to that in a second, the details, how many votes you get, then that's how many of that list get in. Now, sometimes there are parties that are beyond the pale. An example of this might be, for those of you who remember the Jewish Defense League, JDL, and Kahana, Rabbi Kahana. By the way, a new book just came out about a month ago, written by a close friend of mine, a teacher of mine, Shaul Magid, Professor Magid. Meir Kahana, not a biography as much as a analysis of his philosophical analysis and sociological analysis of his writings. Not a lot of people have paid attention. It was mostly about his theatrics. Those of us that grew up in LA, Irv Rubin was his representative. Okay, so that happened to Kahana and his list. A candidate's list shall not participate in elections to the Knesset, and a person shall not be a candidate for election to the Knesset if the objects or actions of the list or the actions of the person expressly or by implication include one of the following. And this is something which sometimes seems to be a little bit of a sensitive issue: negation of the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Often accusations are hurled towards the Arab parties that in essence is they don't really believe in the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. If there's incitement to racism, and that indeed was what happened with Kahana, with Meir Kahana. If there is a party that's running for the Knesset that supports Hamas, for instance, in the Gaza Strip, not the Palestinian Authority, not the connection, but the Hamas, then that would be considered under this to be not allowed. And it's not like 2 years in the House of Representatives or 6 years in the Senate or 4 years from the president. It is the term of the office shall be 4 years from the day on which it is elected. So the Knesset has a life, any given Knesset, like the 123rd Congress, whatever it is today, So we're in the 13th, I think the 13th Knesset, has a life of 4 years. Unless, and I'm not sure that's here. Yeah, unless, of course, the government fails. The coalition falls apart or whatever. And we'll see a little bit more about that in a second. And here's something that would be nice if this country learned. election, well, it's raised from time to time. The election day is a public holiday. And that means it's a very high rate of participation. Okay, so that was dry. And unless you think that the whole lecture is going to be like this kind of frontal thing, those of you that know me from teaching, it's not exactly my style. I do a lot of the talking, perhaps too much, but tonight there's going to be a lot of other speakers.
Israel takes pride in being known as the only democracy in the Middle East, with some of the highest citizen participation in the world. Nevertheless, few Israelis are excited about the upcoming election on March 23rd.
All right, Israel is heading for yet another national election. It's fourth in 2 years.
A bill proposed to avoid the Israeli parliament's dispersal failed to pass in a dramatic vote late last night, now ensuring that Israel will face its fourth general election within 2 years, to be held as soon as March 23rd.
The only democracy in the region can't seem to get elections right. What's going on here? Let's take a step back for a minute and consider how the Israeli system works. While the US and Israel both are democracies, the US has a presidential system and Israel has a parliamentary system, more similar to Canada, Italy, or Germany than to the US. Israel's parliament is called the Knesset. Unlike the US, where the people vote for a presidential candidate once every 4 years, Israelis vote for political parties. Generally, the leader of the party that wins the most seats in the Knesset becomes prime minister for a term that's supposed to last 4 years, but rarely it does. Are you confused? Don't worry, we'll explain. But first, a bit more background. Before Israel gained independence in 1948, the area was ruled by the British, and when they left, many of the systems they had established were adapted or updated. While Israel's system differs from the British one, there are no kings and queens in the Jewish state, the parliamentary system was left intact. The new country's Declaration of Independence guaranteed that Israel will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex, which means that every citizen over the age of 18 gets to vote. Unlike the US, which is massive and is divided into hundreds of districts for congressional voting, Israel is a small country, and everyone votes as a single district. So the vote of a citizen in Beersheba goes into the same pot as a vote from a citizen in Haifa, Jerusalem, Dimona, Shfaram, Kibbutz Dan, and, well, everywhere. As we said, Israelis vote for a party, not a person. The number of votes a party gets determines how many seats it will have in the Knesset. So if one party gets more than half the votes, they'll get more than half the seats in the Knesset, and the person at the top of their party list becomes prime minister. But that has actually never happened in Israel. The Knesset has 120 seats, and the most seats a party has ever won is 56. So after every election, the so-called winner has to negotiate with the leaders of other parties to cobble together a coalition that controls at least 61 seats. Only then can a potential prime minister present a government to the Knesset for a vote of confidence. It doesn't help that literally dozens of parties run in each election. 39 party lists are registered this time, though no more than a dozen or so have a real chance of winning seats. There are parties catering to every political, ethnic, religious, and social group you can think of, and probably a few you never even knew existed. There are lots of ways to do democracy. It'll come as no surprise that there's history here too. When the new state was preparing for its first elections in 1949, the founders felt it was important that everyone feel they were represented in the new government. The country was witnessing an ingathering of hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from 100 countries around the world, in addition to the Jews, Arabs, and others who were already living there. In order to help everyone feel included and counted, it was decided that any party that got 1% of the popular vote would be represented in the Knesset. That contributed to the reality of no party ever getting a majority. To help reach a majority, the minimum threshold was increased to 3.25%. If you vote for a party that doesn't get at least 3.25%, that party won't join the Knesset and your vote gets discarded. All right, so where were we? We know that Israel has a parliamentary democracy, different than the US, but similar to lots of other countries around the world. We know that coalitions are put together by the leader of the biggest party to become prime minister, and we know a government should serve for 4 years. So what went wrong? A Knesset must vote its confidence in a government before it will take office. Should it vote no confidence, the government falls, usually leading to new elections. Back in December of 2018, the government lost the confidence of the Knesset, so elections were rescheduled for April of 2019. After those elections, no party was able to win the support of a majority in the Knesset. So, in an unprecedented move, yet another election was scheduled for September of 2019. But guess what? The same thing happened. No one could get to the magic number of 61. After the third election in March of 2020, the results weren't very different than the first two tries, but it was the beginning of the pandemic. The need for a coalition was framed as a national emergency, and in the spring of 2020, a new government finally took office. It was a marriage of convenience between Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party and Benny Gantz's Blue and White party. The two men agreed to rotate the role of prime minister, with Netanyahu leading for 18 months and Gantz taking the helm for the next 18 months. Netanyahu and Gantz never really liked each other and never particularly trusted each other, but they said they had to come together for the good of the country. Things got rough pretty quickly, and public support for the so-called unity government diminished. In December, the Knesset decreed that new elections would be held in March, and that's how we got to where we are today. Democracy can be fragile, but Israelis have proven to be incredibly resilient. While a few people like the prospect of repeated elections in such a short time, the country seems determined to get it right. On March 23rd, millions of people will go back to the polls, hoping for a stable government that can lead the country for years, not months.
Confusing, but they did a wonderful job of doing this. And I'll share this stuff with everybody afterwards if you'd like to go over it again. This is I-24, which is I'm not entirely sure who's behind it, but it's a different media than people are used to. It's not the Times of Israel. It's not Jerusalem Post. It's not Haaretz. And there may be something, it may be European because they have a French part of them as well, English, French, and I think also a Hebrew section. But of all the things that I saw, first of all, there aren't that many materials because people just got tired of doing this. There was a lot of explanations and educational materials for Jewish schools in the country here up to a point. People just said, we can't keep up with this anymore, right? And so some of the things we're going to look at tonight were produced in 2018, 2019. Before we go on, as confusing, any questions, anything that stands out that you'd like to, oh, sorry.
Israel takes pride.
Rabbi David,
Yes.
we know that some of the parliamentary systems have shadow cabinets. Does that exist in Israel?
No, not in the same way. No. Yeah, I don't know why. Yes.
Voter turnout, is it high, low, or?
I think it's usually above 60, but I'm not sure if I have that information today. It went down a bit because people got tired of doing it. People got a little bit resigned to fatalistic because it's not going to matter anybody. I mean, we know some young people that said that. What difference is it going to make? Any government's a bad government. So, but yeah.
Known as the only.
Yes.
Could you repeat the questions asked here in the audience?
Sure. The question was about voter turnout, and I don't really know, but I know it's usually above 60%. And the other question was about, is there a shadow government like there is, say, in the UK? And no, not that I know of. Yes.
And we have a question, how do citizens feel represented by local politicians?
So that's a really good, important point that came up here, is that you'll notice that she mentioned that there are no districts and the whole 120 is one pot, which raises an issue that you don't have local representation. In Israel, the country is divided into either cities or or regional councils, municipal or regional councils, and those are separate elections. So even if you live on a farm in the countryside, you're part of a, let's call it a county. But so every region, every municipality has the laws that they're in charge of. I don't know if it's more, if it's less than the United States, because here we also have federal laws and state laws. So nothing is really comparable to that. So for instance, wedding laws are not a regional thing. What Tel Aviv did, I was in Tel Aviv for many years, when they wanted to recognize LGBTQ community and couples, they started to put out like a certificate for gay and lesbian couples and allow them to take a couple's membership or a family membership at the municipal pools or clubs, community centers, things like that. That's not changing the laws, but it's a way to navigate around it. Yes.
How do citizens feel represented? No, I'm sorry. Who runs things when the government fails and they are waiting on the next election?
So the government, when the government fails, the ministers who are in position continue to be in position unless they resign. And then sometimes there's some really serious problems. There have been manipulations in the last 4 years of somebody who strategically resigned to cause even a greater headache, usually for Bibi in that case. But those ministers continue. There are professionals who work in each of the ministries that have been there for a long time. But it seems to me, at least up until the Trump era, it seems to me from what I know about American government, there were far more people that stayed in government positions, regardless of the government that was changing. It seems to be a lot more change in Israel with that. Yeah. So those are some of the problems. But you can't go forever. You've got to have elections within a certain amount of time. Yeah. Anything else, Madalena?
No, just that the question from Tim too, because.
Okay. Oh, so what you said, yeah. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said they're elected for 4 years, but then it said they lost confidence in the government, and so they had more elections. What does that mean? They lost confidence, and how is that demonstrated?
Okay, so the term by law is a 4-year term. I'm not even sure if it's ever happened 4 years, but it almost never happens 4 years because you've got to have a party, as we'll see, a party with enough of a majority whose coalition can't be threatened all the time, right? Can't be held back or held hostage by small parties. We'll get to some of those things as we look at this table in a second. And so, Pat's asking how, what does it mean? The government fell, so the 4 years don't happen. Yeah, so that's why there's elections so often. And a government falls, again, means that the same ministers continue until the elections, that the same budget holds. And if they didn't manage to pass a budget, as I said before, they just use the same figures from the year before. It's really messy. And if people want to know, so how come certain things don't move along in Israel, say like the peace process when there was a more left-wing government, or the annexation of the West Bank when there was more right-wing, things don't move so quickly because it takes time to get these things done. And that's similar to governments all over the world and to our government here as well. The kind of standstill because it's constant. The big difference is to remember that if in the United States, it's, at least we perceive it as being two very mighty blocks, which have sub-blocks to them, at two mighty blocks, either you're this or you're that. Yes, I know there's independence, and I know there are different smaller parties, but in Israel, I mean, you could be in a room, you could be at the Rosh Hashanah table, that would be parallel to Thanksgiving here, right? And you'll have representatives of 9 different parties sitting at the same table. So you think here it's polarized. But what I did say beforehand over dinner is that the difference is, I think, and we're going to see some mighty ferocious rhetoric in a few minutes. The difference that I feel in Israel, at least it was until I was living there until 2010, was you could argue and really and swear at each other, but then you go out for a beer together. There was this kind of, okay, that's that, and that's this. By the way, the voting is done. At central locations like schools, kind of like here, and you go into a booth, and in front of you, she said there were 36 or how many, 30 plus parties. Each party has paper, a paper where letters are printed. Each party has their letter representation. So for instance, the Labor Party is Emet, which means truth. So they kind of got a good one. Bet is the National Religious Party. Likud is, I never voted for Likud, so I don't remember. It's Machal, Mem Chet Lamed, because that's an old part, Mifleget Cherut Leumit. So for different reasons, there's things, and you have to go in and find your piece of paper, and you put it in an envelope and seal the envelope and drop it in a box. And that way it's simpler than here. I'm always afraid here I'm gonna sign or mark the wrong way. Yes.
You say that people, when you left in 15, that they'd sit around the table and they'd all 9 different parties. And they'd all argue, and then they'd go out for a beer. Is that still going on, or is it changed?
So I that's why I said it was at least until I lived until the end of the aughts, until 10, 11 years ago. Things I think got more, look at the world, politics around the world got more polarized in the last 10 years, last 15 years. Not just in this country, just a lot of places. And the wave of, not taking a position, but I think we can describe wave of nationalism in this country, the anti-immigration, and a certain style of politics and rhetoric is similar to what happened in the United States, what happened in Israel, what happened in the United Kingdom, in England, happened in Hungary at different levels, in different places, Germany in a smaller way, even Sweden, where I lived for a while. Those kinds of, that there's this wave and with that nationalism comes, I think, more of a separatism, more of a, I think, I'm not an expert at political science, but let's take a look at, yes.
Do you feel the average Israeli citizen believe they are represented compared to the US, where few feel they are represented?
I don't know the answer. One of the challenges with that is the regional thing, because your region's not representative. It can be, but not necessarily. I don't know if you voted for the winner, you feel represented, right? But let's take a look at the parties, and maybe I can answer that question. Do typical Israelis feel represented by their parties the way it's done? I don't know. Interesting question. I know that I felt represented in the years that I voted for the parties I voted for, basically one party, but that party was always in the minority, and that view of Israeli politics, it is more in the minority now. It didn't mean I felt properly represented by them, but they had no power. But I just look at myself, so that means that I'm part of a minority. I have to accept that. So let's take a look at this table here. This was the outcome of the 23rd March election. Likud is there used to be, it's a different name. It used to be a party called Machal. They are the largest party, right? Although they went down 7 seats, and we'll see in a second why that happened, they still had 24% of it with 30 seats. Now, 30 seats is a long way from 61. But you think, well, there's other right-wing parties, they'd come together. Yesh Atid, which is a moderate party, kind of middle of the road, not a leftist, not a rightist necessarily. Yair Lapid, Bibi, I don't have to introduce, I think everybody knows Bibi Netanyahu. Really grew up in Israeli politics, went to the right, was in the army in the right unit. His brother was a fallen hero. His father was a professor. Bibi grew up a lot in the United States, which is why his English is so good. Very good rhetorical skills, really a master speaker. Yair Lapid comes from the world of media, of TV. And his father was a well-known politician who was, maybe a bit to the left. I don't know if we would call it to the moderate left. And his father was a journalist and a politician, journalist that became a politician. So was Yair Lapid. Very nice looking guy, very much part of the social scene in Tel Aviv. So they got 17 seats with 14%, and they added in this last elections. Shas, which by the way, Shin Samech is the acronym of the set of Talmud. So, but they wanted, I think maybe because of Sfaradim. It's a party that grew up decades ago, really as kind of a reaction to the Ashkenazic centrism of the state of Israel. It's an expression of Mizrachiyut, of Sfaradim, of people who felt that they weren't represented, and they were able to quickly multiply themselves. They got in key positions right away. They were needed for governments, so they had key positions, especially the Ministry of Interior, Aryeh Deri especially, and they were able to funnel funds, tons of funds, to their institutions. That's kind of how it goes. That's not really what happens in this country. It's totally kosher in Israel. And so they were able to bring up a generation and a half of families, mostly poor families, or certainly lower income families, that came through their institutions that felt, well, we owe this to you. So we vote, kind of like, I guess, Chicago was in ancient times. LA didn't seem to be like that when I was growing up in the 60s. I don't know how much I knew. So that's Aryeh Deri. They are, on one hand, they're members of Knesset are Ultra-Orthodox. They're Sephardic, they're not Hasidic. Right? So they have fedoras usually, or no hats with little black, maybe black velvet kippot, skull caps, usually dark suits, mostly with beards, but not long beards. And they're obedient to rabbis. They always have a rabbi who is their ultimate authority on things. Blue and White Party, which was Benny Gantz's party, a former commander-in-chief of the Israeli army, not a great politician. It's not just me, everybody would say. I think with good, from my point of view, good values, but was totally always being outmaneuvered by Bibi. And they went into a coalition to form the previous government, which of course did not last at all. And they went down. By the way, when numbers go down, very often it's because certain members of Knesset, when the numbers go up, because certain members have gone from one party to another party. It's not necessarily because the ideology of the people has changed. It's really goes along with people. Now, Naftali Bennett used to be part of a party called the Abait HaYehudi. We'll get to them in a second. The religious Zionists, or what was before the religious Zionists, and he formed a new party with some others. He became the prime minister. We'll try to explain in a few minutes why, even though they only have 7 seats, right? So we'll get to the coalition in a second, but the coalition is headed by Yesh Atid with 17 seats and Yamina with 7 seats. That's only 24, but they were able to gather others, as we're going to see in a second. Traditionally, in the beginning of the state of Israel, the bigger party was Likud on one hand, but the stronger party was usually the Labor Party. That was until the 80s. David Ben-Gurion, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin. Those are all people from Golda Meir. Those are all people from the Labor Party. And they were kind of the Ashkenazic party, the founders of the state of Israel, in control for many, many years. And it wasn't until the 80s that there was a turnover where Likud got power through Menachem Begin. They shrunk down to almost nothing. They were even smaller before this election, right? They were down to 1 member with previous elections. So, two members. Three members, and now they're up to 7. And Mirav Michaeli, also a former journalist, a well-known feminist spokesperson in Israel, younger woman. UTJ is United Torah Judaism, which is one of the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazic parties. Doesn't mean some Sephardim don't vote for them, but we're talking about long beards, not really present in the workforce as much. A lot of men that continue to study into their adult years. Ultra-Orthodox, based in Mea Sharim in Jerusalem, or in Bnei Brak, but all over the country as well. You may know that in the 80s there were successive waves of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and also did not feel represented until they kind of took lead. And they've been larger before, and that's Yisrael Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman. He's been kind of the linchpin for elections. He was along with Bibi for a while, then he kind of turned against Bibi. So he's been responsible for a lot of the stuff going on. Religious Zionism used to be much larger party. There used to be just one. There was the Ultra-Orthodox and the modern modern Orthodox. Today, they have become, religious Zionists become very much of a strong right-wing party. And Bezalel Smotrich, their leader, unabashedly homophobic and I would call him almost anti-Semitic, but towards other expressions of Judaism, like Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism. Now we get to some of the Arab parties. The joint list is Ayman Odeh. A different group split off from them. We'll see, which is why they went down. That's the last party there. Ram Mansour Abbas, who eventually joined the coalition. Joint list did not join. New Hope was a breakaway from the Likud. See, it's a new party. It's basically six members, or it's Likud ideology, but it's anti-Bibi. Gidon Sar sees himself as a successor. So wouldn't be surprised in the future if Bibi is out of the picture for whatever reasons, he would come back, and then again they would be a much larger party because they share the same values, except for Bibiism. Bibiism is almost like an ideology for many Israelis, certainly for Bibi himself. And then the second to last is the Meretz Party, which is a left-wing party that did much better than anybody expected themselves. They've also been down. There was a time they were a larger party, and they have often been part of the coalition when there's been a left-leaning coalition. I understand confusing, but it gives you an idea. And these are the parties that got in, right?
So you're really only voting for one party?
You only vote for one party. So
Oh my
people will
God.
strategize before, and they'll try. Sometimes some of the parties pull out, and they'll say because the surveys show, the polls show they're not going to get the 3 and whatever percent thing. So they said, well, it's a wasted vote. So you know what? I'm telling all my voters, vote for one of these larger parties. That happens sometimes. But then you have people that a lot of the parties are one-person parties. There's a list, long list, but they're really one person. And we'll see an interesting example of that in a second. Yes.
When a party wins seats, how do they decide which candidate actually serves in the Knesset?
So when a party wins seats, how do they decide which of the candidates fill those seats? Because the parties beforehand meet before the elections, meet to determine a list of 120. So if it was Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid is at number 1. And then it's the first ones that get in. And usually the very top, if they're part of the coalition, they become ministers in the government as well. I've known lots of people in my life who have been on lists of the Knesset, but they've been, 50 onwards or 40 onwards with never a chance. A colleague of mine, a rabbinic colleague, Rabbi Ehud Bandel, we worked together, was on the merits list. Maybe it was his last election. No, but it was always in the 20s or 30s or 40s. It wasn't realistic. Now, how the parties form those lists is really interesting. Only some of them have democratic processes, like the Likud. Ironically, Likud with Bibi, who is the most kind of, I'm talking too much that will be perceived as tendacious, but Bibi is not democratic in his nature and the way he does things. Yet, the vast majority of Likud members, the people that pay dues to that you can become a party member by paying duties. Not significant, I don't think. He has the greatest support for them. That's why these others left that party, right? And they took with them others, but he has massive support. But I think Yesh Atid is going to have their first inner election just coming up. They're a new party. They're less than 10 years old, right? Or about 10 years old. Anything else?
Prime Minister Benedict, what party does he belong to?
Okay, we're going to get into this second, but here's one of the ironies of this coalition. He's not from the largest party. He's not from the second largest, third. He's from the 5th largest party that only has 7 seats, 7 out of 120. And that is given fodder to Bibi, for instance, to say that's not a government. That's led by a minority, which is a rhetorical ploy. It's like in our house, it happens all the time, right? People are constantly saying others are not legitimate. So Naftali is in a deal that he reached together with Yesh Atid's Yair Lapid, and it's a rotation government. So 2 years, or 18 months, I think. And not a lot of people are terribly optimistic, hopeful, worrying, depending on your politics, that Yair Lapid is going to take the top commission. Nobody really expects the government to last for 18 months, right? On the other hand, not a lot of people expected it to last until now, and it has. Yeah, okay. All right, anything else? This is the pie chart, just to give you the idea of,
Oh, my God.
you know, just to give you an idea of, we're used to two-party systems. I mean, it's very colorful, it's beautiful, right? A lot of the graphics are from the Israel Policy Forum website, not that first thing I showed you, but a lot of the things. Israel Policy Forum has been in the past at least affiliated with the labor movement, but they're in New York. And they've done a lot of educational materials that I find, you know. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at what happened when this coalition, and nobody, again, but Israelis were sick and tired of elections. We can't do it again. So people just made compromises. Let's see.
60 בעד, 59 נגד, 1. תודה, תודה. חברים, אני מבקש.
יש לי מסר לצועדים בטהרן ולעושי דברם בחיזבאללה ובחמאס. לאופוזיציה בישראל יהיה קול ברור וחזק. ויש לי עוד מסר בשבילם, לא פחות חשוב. We'll be back soon.
בין השרים, חבר הכנסת, מכובדיי,
אדוני ראש הממשלה, בנימין נתניהו. גברתי, נשיאת...
חבר הכנסת סמוטריץ', נא להוציא אותו מהמליאה מיד. נא להוציא אותו מהמליאה מיד. את חברת הכנסת וולדיגר, נא להוציא חברת הכנסת גולן מהמליאה. נא להוציא אותה מהמליאה. אני רוצה עליתי הנה רק מסיבה אחת, אני רוצה לבקש סליחה מאמא שלי. שום דבר.
You notice that Bibi said in English, I'll be back, we'll be back. That's
yeah.
totally Terminator, right? That's his intention, to mimic the Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you thought that people in the United States Senate, or well, Senate is be a little bit more dignified perhaps in that the House of Representatives could be discourteous, or if you thought the Parliament in England is right, you see that this is really, this has been going on for years. It's not just this, I mean, but this was those speeches were when the government was formed to celebrate. Yair Lapid could not give his speech. He was heckled so much, and that's what he asked. If you saw, he asked his mother for forgiveness. He says, "I'm sorry." He said his mother, but she had to see this.
So,
Yeah, I'm emotional because to me that was, and these are embarrassing scenes for me.
Yeah.
I love the country. I believe in the government, the democracy, but there was just this but they could not believe that they wouldn't be in power. Sound familiar?
yeah.
So there's different aspects. Now, one of the things that we will be talking about when we get to the meeting that we do about the settler movement is that there's a lot of guys with automatic weapons, with M16s and other kinds of military grade weapons that they have to supposedly protect themselves at home. And there have been threats of this kind of stuff, to some of the same problems. No way am I saying, oh, it's just like America, it's just like Israel. That's not my point. My point is that it's a very volatile situation. Yes, Pat, did you want to ask something?
No, I think you answered it.
Anybody at home before we go on? So when you see a picture, when I see a picture like this, it causes a smile because they're strange bedfellows in many ways. And whether it was posed this way, let's just take the left-hand side. In the front, doesn't look too happy, does he? Avigdor, left-hand side front, Avigdor Lieberman. We're looking to see, yeah, left. Avigdor Lieberman, he's a power broker kind of a politician. And he gets things done. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs when I was outside in Sweden. I met some of the people that he appointed. Not my style at all, but he gets things done. And he was determined that Bibi had to fall. And I'll give the benefit of the judgment that because it wasn't healthy for Israel's democracy. The one who's smiling and looks very photogenic, that's Yair Lapid with the good teeth after him. After him is Naftali Bennett. Now, Naftali Bennett, you'll see pictures. He wears a kippah, but he wears a kippah that's about this big. He's that's kind of that modern Orthodox world that he comes from. His parents are American, by the way, so his English is very good. And on the right-hand side is, I don't know who's in the left behind it, probably says here. It's Gidon Sar, we can't see his face, who broke away from Likud, who definitely has aspirations to be prime minister. On the right-hand side is Mansour Abbas, really interesting from an Islamist party, really interesting development there. Merav Michaeli, who's the Labor Party, or looking straight ahead. Benny Gantz, the military man, who also isn't so happy because he didn't do that well, but also he's the Minister of Defense, which is a great job. I'm always happy when a former commander-in-chief is the Minister of Defense, because they really know that's not always been the case. And then in the front is Nitzan Horowitz, is probably the only one I can say, well, the only one in this picture who I know I would consider a friend. He's been in the Knesset for a long time, and he was very involved in the Eddie. He's an out gay man who was also a former newscaster, media person, and I was often invited to the Knesset for Gay Pride, or for Pride Month, and for to give a talk there about our approach, our religious approach. So Nitzan, he's my guy, but in the minority, right? Merits. Okay, so this is really a historic photo. Naftali Bennett, really unexpected. Nobody would have expected he would have become the prime minister. But I have to say, I feel that he's doing, personally, again, it's not objective, I think he's doing a good job. Also, I have to remember, he is from the settler movement, right? One of his previous jobs was the secretary of that, or the executive director of that organization, of the settlers. And so we have very different politics, but he has put that on the back burner for now, as Meretz has put on the back burner the peace process. Because right now, not just the pandemic, but there's a government there's governing that needs to be done. How are we doing time-wise? We have to finish it.
Oh, we got about a half hour.
Okay, great. Okay, so before I go on to show you, okay, before I go on to show a little bit of the very vivid propaganda, pre-election propaganda, not from this, I think less was produced this time, people got tired, but huge budgets are spent on that. Are there any other questions or comments before we go on? Madalena, anything?
Yeah, I guess I'm not understanding when you say the government fails. What is the definition? How do you even know when the government fails?
The government fails, or the word that you used beforehand.
You might want to repeat it.
Yeah, how do we know when the government fails? Well, the word you used last time you asked the question was the word that's usually used when the government falls. And the reason it calls falls.
They lose confidence.
Exactly. That's how we know the government ceased to. New elections are called when. Part of the problem is the usage of the word, the semantics here, the usage of the word government. In Israel, no. In Israel, a government is the coalition, the ruling coalition that makes up the ministers. That's the problem. Okay, now maybe that's so.
So it's not here like we've elected someone for 4 years.
Right, and it
we
doesn't
haven't.
matter what, unless of
Yeah.
course they commit a crime
Right,
or
right.
they die or God,
Yeah.
whatever, right? But there's no way for that to happen.
Doesn't always matter if they put.
And so yeah, if a government is formed, that is a ruling coalition is formed when they have at least 61 votes in the Knesset. You may have noticed up here that it was 59 to 60. Did anybody notice that?
Yes.
That means that somebody agreed to abstain.
Yeah,
They didn't want to support the government.
yeah.
That's one of the members of the Arab Party, or the Arab parties, because of, I think because of the Sheikh Jarrah issue. There was a particular issue that was happening that he didn't, I can't support this government, but I don't have to vote against it.
But if these group of people, this coalition is voted for 4 years, what helps?
No.
The
The
coalition.
members of Knesset are voted in for a 4-year term.
Okay,
That 4 years can happen as long as they form a coalition
oh,
and which continues to govern. If that coalition falls apart, they have an opportunity. The president, this is where the president does have some real power. The president asked the leader of the largest party to form a new coalition, right? You can try to form,
okay.
you can rearrange it right after the elections. They have a certain amount of weeks for and extensions before they have to call elections again. And so as long as there are 61 people or majority of the members, sometimes they're away, whatever, and they kind of balance it out. I think they may do that here in Congress as well. Then as long as you have a majority of the members of the Knesset who are elected to 4 years, they'll fulfill that 4-year term. But if a government cannot continue to function, let's call it right now function, and it falls, then elections have to happen within a certain amount of time. Yes, Madalena.
How does the coalition fall apart? What causes that?
What causes a coalition to fall apart? A law doesn't get passed that they want passed, a peace process, a war. I mean, all sorts of things. Wars haven't happened. Usually the country comes together in wars, but a coalition can fall when not all the members are getting what they want. And that's why small parties have had an inadvertent amount of power, because sometimes it's one person who's the linchpin. We see that now in many ways in the Democrats, in the Senate right now, right? There's one person, maybe two, that are saying, no, wait a minute, I want the bill to be done. And it doesn't matter how many phone calls they get or how many, because they have that power. A lot of it has to do with the personalities of the people. Some of it has to do with the guidelines of the party. A party may have accepted a platform that they're committed to. And if the platform is not being accommodated in that coalition agreement. So for instance, if it wouldn't happen, but if Bennett's government, if the ministers, they can make a lot of policies, they decided to annex the West Bank. Well, then the Arab Party and the Labor Party and Meretz, they would leave the coalition. That's how a government can fall.
Okay. Now it's
Okay?
clear. Yeah, thank you.
Tricky business, I understand.
Thank you.
Anything else before I go on? So let's see a little bit how the campaigns went. Here, campaigns used to happen when somebody came to town, right? Televised, not televised, that changed with different media, the news companies, whatever. And then of course, social media changed it drastically. And one candidate in particular learned to utilize social media in a very effective way. In Israel, the government pays from the election budget, pays for each of the parties, depending in proportion to how large they are, how many members of Knesset they have beforehand. And if they weren't in before the new party, they get almost nothing. They get money to produce campaign materials. And the most expensive, of course, are TV ads. And they're not ads for this advertisement was paid for by. There's a section on the news for a certain amount of time before the elections. There's a section before the news, after the news, where it used to be there was one and then there were only 2 stations. So everybody get together to watch the party's commercials. their propaganda things. And you get we didn't use popcorn. We had, sunflower seeds, you get the drinks, you sit, a cup of coffee, everybody watches it and they laugh or they curse and the next day there's a part of the newspaper that has critique, like there is after a new TV program, whatever.
Yeah.
So did they do well or not? So that's what you're going to see now. A few of them. I culled out of many of them what I thought were some of the most interesting.
So it's like watching the Super Bowl ads.
Like watching the Super Bowl ads. Yeah, it would be like that. Only the Super Bowl ads, you could take them or leave them. This is about your life. This is about, you may decide not to buy Bud. It's not a life in, well, for some.
Benjamin Netanyahu, there's nobody like him. He's a winner. He's highly respected. He's highly thought of by all.
He's done a great job as prime minister. He's tough, he's smart, he's strong.
A strong prime minister is a strong Israel. And you truly have a great prime minister.
Netanyahu, Yamin, Hazak.
This was an ad not for the United States.
No.
This was an ad for Israel.
Right.
Benjamin Netanyahu, Yamin Hazak, a strong right. So double entendre, right? Which works in English and in Hebrew as well, right? Moving to the right. And isn't it amazing that they thought, at least the campaign, and maybe they did, that what's going to get more votes is because Trump endorses him. Well, you may know that Trump was far more, even today, I think, far more popular. That certainly Obama was not popular by vast amounts of Israelis, was perceived to be an enemy, not by myself, not by people that I know, not by, but even you would say perhaps Biden, people would be a little bit more balanced. When I was in Israel last in July, people say, well, how could you guys do that? How could you possibly do that? Just a personal comment. Now, when I was in yeshiva in the 70s, when was Nixon impeached? What year? Nixon impeached. When?
73.
73. So Nixon was impeached, and then it was Ford, right? Ford got Ford. And I remember complaining to my study partner. We were studying Talmud together. We're supposed to be studying Talmud together. And I said something about, Ford, is not. He says, nothing like Nixon. Huh? I said, oh, God forbid. He said, how could you not like Nixon? Nixon was great for Israel. I said, Menchie, my father taught me that if a president is good for Israel, a president is good for the United States. If the United States is not healthy from a leadership point of view, it's oversimplified, I understand. If it's not healthy then it's not going to be a great help to Israel. Now, many people would argue that Trump was the best thing that happened to Israel. Not my opinion. That's not really to the point. The point of this is to show that at least the strategists of the Likud felt that people knowing that Trump was behind him, which, by the way, also an interesting thing, right? That an American president would publicly endorse. But besides that, so that's just an interesting thing. And there was a lot of similar. You would see them wearing the same ties, the same kind of look. Bibi would often use the Trumpisms. Trump would often use Bibiisms. I think they're really what do they call it? Best bro.
Some of the same consultants.
Yeah.
American political consultants.
Yeah, and that's been going on for a long time. Right. So let's take a look. So that's from the Likud. This is another Likud advertisement or advertisement.
חברות וחברי הליכוד היקרים, אני קורא לכם לבוא ולהצביע בפריימריז מחר יום שלישי.
שיתוף הפעולה היום בין המשטרה לבין השב"כ לבין צה"ל הוא קריטי. מי שינסה לפגוע במדינת ישראל יקבל תגובה קשה מאוד. נמשיך את הלחימה בארגוני הטרור גם בתוך בתי הכלא.
I should have framed this. This is for campaigning for the primaries in the Likud. So you have to be a member of the Likud to vote in the primaries. The numbers on the side are the numbers on the roster of the Likud. Has nothing to do with their importance. I don't know how they decide the numbers. But that's how you would vote for you would place. I think in some cases the primaries are for a certain amount of the list. Sometimes all the list, but that's how. And this is this guy now is the it's not good. Sorry.
חברות וחברי הליכוד היקרים, אני קורא לכם לבוא ולהצביע בפריימריז מחר יום שלישי.
שיתוף הפעולה היום בין המשטרה לבין השב"כ לבין צה"ל הוא קריטי. מי שינסה לפגוע במדינת ישראל יקבל תגובה קשה מאוד. נמשיך את הלחימה בארגוני הטרור גם בתוך בתי הכלא. משיקים את פרויקט מצלמות הגוף הכי גדול בעולם. אנחנו צריכים לעבור מההגנה להתקפה. אני יודע שאהבתם את הפרגון שלי לחבריי בליכוד, אבל עכשיו, רגע לפני ההצבעה בפריימריז, תזכרו, כשאתם מחזקים אותי בהצבעה שלכם, אתם בעצם שומרים על הליכוד שאתם רוצים, ליכוד מוביל ואיכותי. אז תנו לי את הכוח להמשיך ולייצג אתכם בכבוד, לחזק את הליכוד ולחזק את המדינה.
בפריימריז בוחרים ארדן, מחזק את הליכוד ומחזק את המדינה.
We also serve you. Also notice the music he uses what kind of music.
פחות 616 זה 169, 2x פלוס 4,891 שווה 6,243 פחות 6x, 6x מעבירים צד שני זה 8x שווה 169 גרם, משהו מוזר, יאללה, שורש של 10,000 ועוד 3 כפול 66, קודם כל סוגריים זה 23 כפול 69, שורש של 10,000 זה 169 גרם. מאות מילוליות. לדני 100 שקלים, יופי 31 שקלים פחות מדני, זאת אומרת שיש לו 69, ועוד 100 של דני זה 169, יש לו שניהם ביחד. כמעט חיבוק גדול, באמת מה שצריך עכשיו, אבל...
Gematria is the numerical value of each letter.
כל התשובות אותו דבר. נראה לי שיש פה טעות. יש פה טעות נראה לי, אתם יודעים?
לא, זו לא טעות. הפתרון היחידי למבחן ב5 לפברואר הוא 169. תנו לי את הכוח להמשיך ולעשות למען עם ישראל, מדינת ישראל ותורת ישראל. בעזרת השם נעשה ונצליח. 169.
She's equally vocal, but there's a woman at least in this collection. Notice the difference in approach to advertising, but there was nothing in it really that was substantial as far as what she'd done. She hadn't done a lot much, but she's created a lot of problems because she's very loose with her mouth and what she says. What's that?
I think she was the one they pulled out of the parliament when the other guy was trying to give his speech and she was.
Yes, that
removed-
Mary
she
was in the back,
removed
right.
From the room.
Yes, yeah. So,
Comments from Frank Riella. If you watch the Netflix series Borgen, you get an excellent overview about how a parliamentary system works, even though it's Denmark and not Israel.
right, except the comment by Frank is that if you want, it's what's it called? Borgen. Yeah, the wonderful series about the Danish Parliament. Yeah, you do get an idea. That's a nice idea. It's a great series. In the same way you get some idea maybe of how the American government worked by watching The West Wing, except for it's Denmark. It's a lot more civilized, I think. Okay, we're almost done. Now we're at the Shas party. That's the kind of the Sephardic Ultra-Orthodox party, and yeah, this one is, I think, without words in English. This is just to see what kind of images are they going to use. Putting on tefillin, praying at a cemetery of tzaddikim, doing things for Sukkot, saying certain prayers. Right? This is your honor, this is your dignity, this is your legacy, kind of a thing. Shas had advertisements one year. I remember saying, you really should be going back to what you used to do when you were younger. You know, it's this kind of the good old days. Yeah. And their theme has always been Lachzir Atara Liyoshna, to return the crown to its rightful position. That is the crown of Torah. So you see Torah imagery or Sephardic Torah scroll imagery in their stuff. Now we've got something there. Percy is not involved anymore, but Eli Yishai was able to rise to prominence when Aryeh Derieh, who's back in charge, was in jail. Right? There's been a lot of misusage of funds, of misappropriation when he was the minister of the Interior. Eli Yishai was in charge for a while, and he produced this. This is one that touches on our own reality, those of us that have any connection to the reform movement in the United States.
שיבוא יום והרפורמים יבקשו חלק מנחלת הכותל. ברא אתה על אלוהים, אלוהינו מלך עולם. רק שתבינו, הרפורמים מגבים נישואים בין יהודים ונוצרים. הרפורמים קוראים לנו את עם ישראל לשני חלקים, ועכשיו הם מבקשים רחבה גדולה יותר מזו של הנשים והגברים גם יחד. הטקסים של הרפורמים עושים מקומם בתיאטרון, לא בקודשי ישראל. אני לא מכיר בר דעת אחד שהיה מוכן לתת מקום לרפורמים ברחבת הכותל ולקחת סיכון. שיום אחד נמצא שם טקס בר מצווה, מתלווים עם כיפה וציצית. בוחרות ובוחרים יקרים, ברחבת הכותל מארחת בכל השנה את כולם, דתיים, חילונים, חרדים, גברים ונשים, עולים, ותיקים, וגם כאלו שאינם יהודים. המשותף לכולם הוא שבשביל הכותל מגיע מבחינת כבוד, התרגשות מחדת הקודש. לצערי הממשלה לא היטיבה לעמוד על המשמר ולהוציא את רחבת הכותל בכל דיון ציבורי וויכוח. מה המחיר של זה? כל ראש חודש מגיעות קבוצת נשים הזויות, עטופות בציצים, גונבות ספר תורה, מרחבת הגברים, ורצות איתו לחגוג את הביזיון של המסורת שלנו, בושה להם. מי שיש לו לב יהודי חם, מי שכואב לו על הכותל שלנו, לא יכול לשבת בחיבוק ידיים, לא יכול לסלוח שעושים פוליטיקה על המסורת שלנו, ומבזים את הכותל שלנו. אנו בעזרת השם לשמור על קדושת הכותל, נקי מפרובוקציות. פתק לתנועת יחד, פתק למסורת ישראל, ופתק למורשת ישראל. בדלת בניסן, ב9 באפריל, הצביעו יחד, כי ביחד ננצח למען עם ישראל ותורת ישראל.
So he broke away from Shas because he wasn't on the leadership and formed Yachad. So what did he make his celebrity cause, right? There's an agreement, and that's a whole other thing. What happens at the wall, there was violence there just last week, whenever it's Rosh Chodesh, whenever it's the new month, the women of the wall meet. They try to meet in the women's section, try to bring in a Torah scroll, and then they were moved to another section. Another section was widened. Naftali Bennett, when he was head of the Ministry of Interior, Religious Affairs, he was able to actually make a larger section there. This has been going on for many years, for 2 decades at least. An agreement was reached, I think, in 2014. It was never implemented because Bibi always needed the ultra-Orthodox for his government, even though it was a government decision and it was that. And this, of course, is something that's very important to diaspora Jews, because people want to go to the Western Wall, to the Kotel, in their eyes, not mine, but in their eyes, the holiest place on earth, to give expression to their own prayer. Our daughter, Debbie, who was a Reform rabbi in Jerusalem, for many years, she coordinated the bar and bat mitzvah schedule at that wall, what we used to call the Masorti Kotel. And I've officiated in many celebrations there where men and women can be together. But the women of the wall, they actually don't want to be there. They want to be in the women's section and to be able to do a Torah reading just for women. So a lot of violence there. A difficult situation. Questions? So he made this into, that was his main issue. So what does he do? Somebody for him scoured the internet, not scoured, searched the internet, combed the internet and they found that one, remember that item came up, it was talking about ridiculous, and then they get this woman who's making a blessing and she messes up the words. It's like, look at them, they're stupid, they're idiots. And that becomes, how many dogs have had bar mitzvahs in the history of humanity or the Reform movement? I don't know, maybe more, I don't know, it's not really about that. I mean, that's, of course, but that's a way to get voters, but he didn't get it. Right. Okay. And I think I've got, what's that? Yeah. I think I've got one more. So now on the other side, the Labor Party and the two-state solution, which sometimes people think in this country for a while, because of AIPAC's successful work amongst many American Jews, thought the two-state solution was like almost naughty, it was almost too liberal. But that, of course, still is, I think, to a degree, a major part of the platform of the Labor Party and the left-wing parties.
דמוקרטית ופתוחה, עם גבולות ברורים וצבא חזק. אבל אצל הליכוד, הכל הפוך. הליכוד מסכן את ישראל ומקרב אותנו בכל יום לסיפוח של 3 מיליון פלסטינים. רק אנחנו נעשה בדיוק הפוך. נקדם יוזמה מדינית להיפרדות מהפלסטינים על בסיס פתרון 2 מדינות, שישמור על ישראל יהודית ודמוקרטית. היפרדות מהפלסטינים, זאת הדרך שלנו לשינוי. חוזרים לדרך, חוזרים לעבודה.
Avigabai didn't last for long. That was Michaeli. They've had a real crisis over the last 2 decades in leadership. Again, this Golda Meir's party. And one last, there is Itamar Ben-Chorin. Otzma Yehudit is a party that got in, but this is from before the previous election. This is kind of the legacy of Meir Kahane here. Making fun of the guidelines for where you can shoot.
That's me. הם קובעים את הידיים של החיילים שלנו. אנחנו באים לשנות.
So basically encouraging soldiers to disobey their commands. And he's in the Knesset, unfortunately. Okay, I think that is. We'll get out of here in time. Another short one, just having you so we cover the Arab parties as well. This is actually a party of Jews and Arabs, which is not represented.
وتعزيز تأثيرنا وضمان حقوق أبنائنا وبناتنا في هذا الوطن.
نحن أصحاب قضية، حقوقنا مشتقة من انتمائنا لوطننا. المساواة القومية والمدنية الواحدة تكمل الأخرى.
בשביל לחולל מהפכות חייבים לצאת מאזור הנוחות. ללכת נגד הזרם, להיאבק למען שותפות, שוויון מלא לכל האזרחים.
التحديات الكبيرة تزيدنا إصرارا على بذل كل الجهود لربط الشعبي بالبرلماني والسياسي بالشخصي والقومي باليومي. هم الناس هو همنا.
يحاولوا يوزعوا شرعيتنا مع كل هجمة عنصرية نثبت في الأرض أكثر. البقاء والمواطنة يشتغلوا سوا. نحن هنا وهنا سنبقى. من أجل العدالة الاجتماعية.
بإلغاء قانون القومية.
מול הגזענות בונים שותפות.
من أجل المساواة القومية والمدنية.
למען שלום צודק.
Okay. Oh, we'll be out of here. You just have to see this last one. When one party.
Oh my gosh.
Don't be mistaken. This is indeed an election rally. That of Zehut, meaning identity. A right-wing political party that defines itself as ultra-liberal, advocating legalization of cannabis in Israel. The party's leader, Moshe Feiglin, is well known in the Israeli right, ever since the Oslo Accords back in 1993. Convicted for civil disobedience, for organizing mass blockades of public highways in protest of the Oslo process.
Zehut is a party of freedom. Legalization is a good example of the state's excessive interference in the private lives of citizens. We want a free market, not just in cannabis, but also in the economy, in education, and in...
Okay, so thank you to the library. Thank you to Madalena. The last point is to show that even one person can try to push a party. He didn't get in. He has nothing to do with weed, but he found some people. And there have been parties that are for changing the law about marijuana for years. They never get in, of course. They love having their commercials. It's like they have a good time doing it, right? It's almost a joke for them. He was thrown out of the Likud. He's more right than the Likud, this guy. And so basically, if I had to sum up, it's a mess, but it's an interesting mess. And right now, it seems to be working. So if somebody would say to me, do you think it's going to last? I have no idea. I hope it would last for 4 years. Wouldn't that be a lovely surprise? And from my point of view, this is the time to put aside some of the larger issues, like coming to a final agreement. It pains me to say that, but it's certainly better than annexation of the West Bank. There's so many social issues, so many environmental issues that need to be dealt with. And this is the beginning of our 4-part journey. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.